Aquarius, welcome back. I hope you're doing well wherever this message finds you. Okay, before we even get into the cards, I have to say, there is something very thoughtful about this energy. It's quiet, but it's powerful. The kind of energy that doesn't demand attention, yet somehow becomes impossible to ignore. As always, this is a general reading, so take what speaks to you and leave what doesn't. Today, we're going to explore what's shifting behind the scenes, what someone may finally be starting to understand, and why your presence seems to be leaving a much deeper impression than they ever expected. So let's settle in, Aquarius, and see where this story wants to take us. Okay, the first card that wants to come forward here is the Judgment card. And honestly, Aquarius, this doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet. It feels like somebody's sitting alone with their own thoughts after spending a very long time trying not to think about something at all. You know, I'm getting this image of someone who has been keeping themselves busy, always moving, always distracting themselves, always finding another task, another responsibility, another reason not to sit still. Because sitting still would mean feeling, and feeling would mean acknowledging something they've spent a long time avoiding. The moment this Judgment card landed on the table, I immediately felt that energy. Not regret exactly. Not yet. More like awareness. The kind of awareness that arrives unexpectedly. The kind that shows up while driving home, while lying awake before falling asleep, while staring out a window for no particular reason. And somehow your name enters their mind again, your face, your voice, a conversation they thought they had forgotten, a moment they thought was insignificant. And suddenly it doesn't feel insignificant anymore. Honestly, that's what keeps standing out here. There are things this person once considered ordinary about you that no longer feel ordinary at all. The way you listened, the way you paid attention, the way you noticed things nobody else seemed to notice. At the time, they didn't think much about it. They assumed that kind of connection would always be there, that your energy would remain available, that your understanding would remain constant. But distance has a strange way of changing perspective. Sometimes people only realize the value of something when they can no longer reach out and touch it whenever they want. And Aquarius, I keep feeling that happening here, because sitting right beside Judgment is the Star card. Wow, this energy feels incredibly personal. Not because they're idealizing you, not because they're placing you on some unrealistic pedestal. It's actually the opposite. It's almost like they're finally seeing you clearly. For a long time, I think this person looked at life through the lens of their own fears, their own insecurities, their own distractions. Everything was filtered through whatever they happened to be carrying emotionally. But something has shifted, and the Star card feels like a moment where the noise becomes quieter, the excuses become weaker, the distractions stop working the way they used to, and what remains is the truth of how they genuinely feel when they think about you. You may not even realize how often your energy crosses this person's mind, because from the outside they may appear perfectly fine, perfectly composed, perfectly unaffected, but underneath that surface, there's a growing recognition that you impacted them in ways they never expected. You changed something, not by trying to, not by convincing them, not by forcing anything, just by being yourself. And I think that's part of what makes this difficult for them to process. Because this wasn't planned, this wasn't something they prepared for. It just happened. The Star card feels like them looking back and realizing that some of their happiest memories contain your presence somewhere in the background. Maybe not every memory, maybe not every moment, but enough moments that it becomes impossible to ignore. Enough moments that they begin asking themselves questions they never asked before. Questions like, why does this person still matter to me? Why do I still think about them? Why does their absence feel different from everyone else's? And then we arrive at the moon. Okay, this is where things become really interesting, because the moon doesn't feel comfortable. Not in this story. This feels like somebody standing face to face with emotions they don't completely understand. I think this person spent a very long time believing they had everything figured out, believing they knew exactly what they wanted, exactly what mattered, exactly what deserved their attention. But lately, those answers don't seem as clear anymore. The moon feels like uncertainty, like hesitation, like someone realizing that their heart may have been trying to tell them something for a very long time while they were busy listening to everything else. And honestly, I don't think they're telling many people about this. This feels private, very private. The kind of thoughts that stay hidden behind polite smiles and everyday conversations. Nobody around them would necessarily know what's happening. Nobody would necessarily guess how often your energy appears in their mind. But when they're alone, when the day becomes quiet, when there is nothing left to distract them, that's where these thoughts seem to return. again and again and again, almost as if something inside them is asking for their attention. As if life itself keeps bringing them back to a realization they've been trying to postpone. Because the more they sit with these feelings, the harder it becomes to convince themselves that nothing has changed. And looking at these three cards together, Aquarius, I can't help but feel like someone is standing at the edge of a truth they haven't fully spoken out loud yet, a truth they're only beginning to understand themselves. And the deeper they look into it, the more difficult it becomes to look away. And honestly, Aquarius, that's where this energy starts to feel heavy. The moment the Ten of Wands appears, I get the feeling of someone who is exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from a long day. Not the kind that disappears after a good night's sleep. This feels deeper than that. This feels like somebody who has been carrying far more than anyone realizes. You know, some people make their struggles visible. They talk about them. They ask for help. They let others know when life becomes overwhelming. But this person doesn't feel like that. This feels like somebody who learned a long time ago that they had to handle everything themselves, so they do. Over and over again. They pick up responsibilities nobody asked them to carry. They absorb stress they never fully process. They convince themselves that being strong means staying silent. And for a while, that strategy probably worked. At least on the surface. At least enough to keep moving. But something about this situation feels different. Because whatever they usually use to distract themselves isn't working the same way anymore. The pressure is becoming harder to ignore. And strangely enough, you seem to be connected to that realization. Not because you're creating their burdens. Not because you've done anything wrong. It's almost the opposite. I think your presence exposed just how tired they really are. Because when someone spends years surviving, they forget what it feels like to actually feel safe. They forget what it feels like to let their guard down. And that's where the Hermit starts whispering through this reading. Wow, this feels incredibly lonely. Not physically lonely, emotionally lonely. There's a difference. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely disconnected. You can have conversations every day and still feel like nobody truly knows what is happening inside your heart. And I keep feeling this person sitting with that realization. The Hermit feels like somebody staring at a ceiling late at night. Not because they can't sleep, because their mind won't stop moving. Their responsibilities, their worries, their fears, everything begins piling on top of itself. And underneath all of that, there's a question they don't seem to know how to answer. Who do I become if I stop carrying everything alone? Because that's what they've always done. They've always relied on themselves, always trusted themselves more than anyone else, always believed they needed to solve every problem before allowing somebody close. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes people enter your life before you're ready. Sometimes somebody sees parts of you that you've spent years hiding. And honestly, I feel like that's exactly what happened here. I don't think you saw the polished version of this person. I think you saw pieces they rarely show anybody. Maybe even pieces they didn't fully understand themselves. And that's what makes this connection difficult for them to compartmentalize. Because you became connected to a version of themselves that felt real. Not perfect, not impressive, just real. The moment the Eight of Swords lands beside all of this, I can almost hear their internal dialogue. 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 scenarios, 1,000 reasons why something is complicated, why something is risky, why something should be postponed, why something should wait. And yet none of those thoughts seem to bring peace. They just create more noise. Honestly, this person feels trapped inside their own mind sometimes. Not because they lack intelligence. Quite the opposite. They're constantly analyzing, constantly evaluating, constantly trying to figure everything out before taking a step. But feelings don't always cooperate with logic. And that's frustrating for somebody who likes certainty. Especially when emotions start showing up where they weren't expected. Especially when somebody's absence becomes louder than their presence once was. Because Aquarius, I don't think the burden they're carrying is only about work, or family, or responsibilities. Those things are there, absolutely. But there's another burden quietly growing underneath all of it. The realization that something important may have been neglected. The realization that certain conversations were avoided. Certain feelings were pushed aside. Certain truths were left sitting in the dark. And carrying that awareness takes energy. A lot of energy, particularly for someone who isn't used to admitting vulnerability. You know what this reminds me of? Someone walking through a storm while insisting they're fine. Their clothes are soaked. They're exhausted. They're struggling. But if you ask them how they're doing, they'll smile and say everything's okay. That's the energy I'm feeling. And I think part of them genuinely believed they could continue doing that forever. Keep moving, keep carrying, keep pretending. But the cards don't feel like they're supporting that anymore. The Ten of Wands feels heavier. The Eight of Swords feels louder. The Hermit feels deeper. And somewhere inside all of this, I keep sensing a person beginning to understand that strength and isolation are not the same thing. That surviving and living are not the same thing. That protecting yourself and closing yourself off are not the same thing. Because the truth is, some burdens become impossible to carry alone forever. And I keep feeling them standing at the edge of that realization, looking at their life, looking at their choices, looking at everything they've been trying to manage by themselves, while another layer of the story quietly begins revealing itself underneath the surface. And honestly, Aquarius, this is where the energy becomes impossible for them to neatly organize and put away. Because the Five of Cups is sitting here, and the moment I see it, I don't feel drama, I don't feel chaos, I feel realization. The kind of realization that arrives long after the moment has passed, long after the words were spoken, long after the opportunity was there. You know, there are some mistakes people recognize immediately, and then there are others that only become visible with distance. This feels like the second kind, because I keep sensing someone replaying memories differently than they used to. Not rewriting history, not romanticizing the past, just seeing it from a more honest perspective. And wow, that can be uncomfortable. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden inside what happened, it's hidden inside what didn't happen. The conversation they never started, the vulnerability they never expressed, the chance they never took, the honesty they kept postponing because there always seemed to be another day, another week, another opportunity. But life has a funny way of making people revisit unfinished emotional business, and I feel that happening here. The Five of Cups feels like somebody looking back and realizing that fear had a bigger influence on their decisions than they originally wanted to admit. Not logic, not wisdom. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of being vulnerable, fear of discovering they cared more than they intended to. And the difficult thing about fear is that it often disguises itself as practicality. It convinces people they're being smart, careful, reasonable, when really they're just protecting themselves from uncertainty. Honestly, I think this person believed they were protecting themselves. But as time passes, they're beginning to question whether they were actually protecting themselves at all, or whether they were simply protecting their fears. Because sitting beside the Five of Cups, I see the Six Cups, and immediately the atmosphere changes. Everything softens. The walls feel lower here. The defenses don't feel as strong. This card feels like a memory appearing unexpectedly, a song, a location, a random conversation, a scent, a familiar phrase, something small, something ordinary, yet somehow powerful enough to stop them in their tracks. And suddenly you're there again. Not physically, but emotionally. You know what I mean? It's almost like certain memories carry a life of their own. You don't go looking for them. They simply arrive. And I keep feeling this person experiencing moments like that. Moments where they're reminded of the way you made them feel. Not what you said, not what you did, how you made them feel. Because that's the part people struggle to forget. The emotional experience, the comfort, the safety, the connection, the feeling that somebody genuinely saw them. I think that's what surprises them most. The realization that they haven't found that feeling elsewhere. Not because they haven't met people, not because life stopped moving, but because certain connections leave an imprint that doesn't disappear simply because time passes. And that's where this emotional awakening begins to deepen. Because the Six of Cups doesn't feel like fantasy. It feels personal, very personal, almost as if they're finally allowing themselves to acknowledge something they've been minimizing for a very long time. And honestly, I don't think they expected this process to affect them the way it has. I think they assumed these feelings would eventually fade into the background, become less important, less significant, easier to ignore. Yet somehow the opposite seems to be happening. The more distance exists, the clearer certain things become. The more silence exists, the louder certain truths feel. Which brings us to the Ace of Swords. Okay, this energy cuts through everything. Through confusion, through avoidance, through all the stories people tell themselves when they're trying not to face something directly. Because at some point, Aquarius, people reach a place where maintaining the illusion becomes more exhausting than facing reality. And I feel someone approaching that space. Not because they've figured everything out. Not because all the answers suddenly appeared. But because they're getting tired of arguing with themselves. Tired of creating explanations for something their heart already understands. You know, there's a moment that happens during personal growth when a person realizes they've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking, what if this doesn't work? They begin asking, what if I've been avoiding something important? Instead of asking, why should I care? They begin asking, why do I care so much? And those questions change everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily. The Ace of Swords feels like that quiet shift. The moment somebody stops running from their own truth and starts looking directly at it. And honestly, I don't think the truth is only about you. I think it's also about themselves, about who they've been, about who they've become, about the choices they've made while trying to protect themselves from emotional risk. Because the deeper I sit with this energy, the more I feel someone standing between two versions of their life. The version they've been living, and the version they can finally see more clearly. And somewhere in that space, between memory and understanding, between regret and honesty, another realization seems to be preparing itself to step forward. And Aquarius, the moment the tower lands on the table, I can feel the atmosphere changing, not in a chaotic way, not in a dramatic movie scene kind of way. Honestly, this feels much more personal than that. Because sometimes the biggest shifts don't happen outside of us. They happen quietly inside. A belief collapses, an assumption falls apart. A story we've been telling ourselves suddenly stops making sense. And that's exactly what this feels like. I keep sensing somebody standing in front of a version of themselves that no longer fits. A version built from old fears, old habits, old ways of coping, old ways of protecting themselves. You know, for a long time, this person may have genuinely believed that keeping their distance was strength, that staying detached was freedom, that needing nobody was independence. But something about that perspective feels like it's breaking apart. Because the more they sit with their own thoughts, the harder it becomes to ignore one uncomfortable truth. They're not as fulfilled as they thought they would be. Wow, that's actually a very powerful realization. Because when people build their lives around certain beliefs, they expect those beliefs to make them happy. They expect them to work. They expect them to bring peace, and when they don't, something has to change. The tower feels like that moment. The moment somebody realizes they've been standing inside a structure that no longer supports who they are becoming. And honestly, Aquarius, I don't think this change is happening because somebody forced it. I think life itself has been showing them signs. Small signs, repeated signs. The kind people brush aside at first, the kind they explain away, the kind they pretend not to notice, until eventually they can't ignore them anymore. Because every path they keep trying to return to feels less satisfying than before. Every distraction feels temporary. Every escape feels shorter, and every time they attempt to go back to who they used to be, something inside them says, no, that's not it anymore. The moment the Fool appears beside the tower, the energy becomes incredibly interesting, because I don't feel certainty here. I feel possibility. I feel curiosity. I feel somebody standing at the edge of unfamiliar territory. And honestly, that scares them, maybe more than they would ever admit, because people often talk about change as if it's exciting. But real change can be terrifying. Especially when it requires leaving behind identities you've carried for years. Especially when it asks you to trust yourself without having all the answers. And that's what I keep feeling. This person doesn't have everything figured out. Not even close. But they are beginning to question things they once accepted without hesitation. They're questioning old patterns, old priorities, old narratives, old versions of success, old definitions of happiness, and perhaps most importantly, they're questioning whether the life they've been building actually reflects what they truly want. Because I keep hearing this internal voice growing louder. A voice asking, what if there is another way? Not an easier way. Not a perfect way. Just a more honest way. And Aquarius, sometimes that question changes everything. Not overnight, not all at once, but little by little. Decision by decision. Truth by truth. The Fool feels like somebody becoming willing to explore possibilities they once rejected immediately. Possibilities that involve vulnerability. Possibilities that involve authenticity. Possibilities that involve following their heart a little more than their fear. And wow, that feels very new for this person. Because fear has been driving for a long time. Fear has been holding the map. Fear has been making the decisions. Fear has been deciding what feels safe, what feels risky, what deserves attention, what should be avoided. But fear is beginning to lose its authority. Not because it disappeared, because they are starting to see beyond it. And sitting beside all of this is strength. Okay, this card feels different from the kind of strength they used to rely on. The old version of strength looked like emotional distance, like self-protection, like pretending everything was fine, like carrying burdens without asking for help, like shutting doors before anyone could leave. But this strength card doesn't feel like armor. It feels like courage, the quiet kind, the kind nobody applauds, the kind nobody posts about, the kind that happens internally. Choosing honesty when avoidance feels easier. Choosing growth when familiarity feels safer. Choosing self-awareness when denial feels more comfortable. Honestly, I think this person is beginning to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what happens when fear no longer gets the final vote. And that's important, because I keep feeling them looking at parts of their life with fresh eyes, not judging themselves, not punishing themselves, just seeing things clearly, perhaps for the first time in a very long time. The tower cleared the space, the fool opened the door, and strength is helping them remain present long enough to walk through it. Because something about this chapter feels less focused on what they're losing and more focused on who they're becoming. And as that awareness continues expanding, another piece of the story seems to be drawing closer, one that involves words that haven't been spoken yet, feelings that haven't been fully expressed, and a conversation that appears to be waiting somewhere just beyond the horizon. The moment the Eight of Wands arrives, Aquarius, I can feel movement entering a story that has spent a long time living inside thoughts, reflections, and unspoken emotions. Not rushed movement, not reckless movement, just movement. And honestly, that's significant, because there comes a point when a person can only think about something for so long before the silence starts feeling heavier than the words themselves. I keep feeling that energy here. It's almost like someone has been carrying entire conversations inside their head, practicing what they would say, revisiting things they wish they had said differently, imagining different outcomes, different reactions, different possibilities. You know, sometimes people don't struggle because they have nothing to say. They struggle because what they want to say matters too much. And that's what this feels like. This doesn't feel casual. This doesn't feel superficial. This feels like someone becoming increasingly aware that honesty requires vulnerability. And vulnerability has never been their favorite place to live. But something has changed. Because the version of this person we met earlier in the reading was still trying to control everything. Control their feelings. Control the outcome. Control the uncertainty. Control the possibility of disappointment. Yet the person standing here feels different, not completely transformed, not suddenly fearless, just more willing to acknowledge what exists beneath the surface. And honestly, that may be one of the most important shifts of all, because the Eight of Wands doesn't feel like somebody trying to create a perfect moment. It feels like somebody getting tired of waiting for perfection, tired of waiting until they have every answer, tired of waiting until they feel completely ready. Because life rarely gives people that kind of certainty. Sometimes all they have is sincerity, and sincerity feels much more present here than it did before. The moment the Two of Cups appears, the atmosphere softens again. Wow, this card feels incredibly human, not idealized, not fantasy, not some flawless version of connection. It feels like two people seeing each other honestly. And I think that's what this person is beginning to understand. The connection wasn't powerful because it was perfect. It was meaningful because it was real. You weren't asking them to become somebody else. You weren't asking them to perform. You weren't asking them to prove their worth every day. There was something simple about the way you approached them. Something genuine. Something that allowed them to lower their defenses, even if only for brief moments, and those moments seem to matter more now than they did at the time. Honestly, I think they're beginning to understand that genuine connection is rare. Not impossible, just rare. The kind of connection where somebody sees beyond appearances, beyond achievements, beyond masks, beyond carefully constructed identities. The kind of connection where a person feels accepted without needing to earn that acceptance first. And the more they reflect on that, the harder it becomes to treat it like just another experience. Because it wasn't, at least not from their perspective anymore. The Two of Cups feels like them recognizing the emotional value of something they once tried to intellectualize. Something they once tried to analyze instead of feel. And wow, that realization carries a lot of weight. Because once people begin acknowledging what truly matters to them, certain priorities start rearranging themselves naturally. Things that once seemed urgent lose importance. Things that once seemed unimportant suddenly become impossible to ignore. And that's where the Ace of Pentacles quietly enters the story. Okay, this card feels grounded, very grounded. After everything we've explored, the reflection, the regret, the awakening, the change. The Ace of Pentacles feels like somebody wanting something tangible, something honest, something they can actually build, not a fantasy, not a dream, not an idea, a reality. And honestly, Aquarius, I think that's what makes this energy feel mature, because this person isn't sitting in nostalgia anymore. They're not sitting entirely in regret. They're not sitting entirely in fear. They're beginning to ask themselves a different question. Not, what did I lose? But, what do I want to create moving forward? And that's a very different conversation. Because one question focuses on the past. The other focuses on possibility, not guaranteed outcomes, not certainty, just possibility. And I keep sensing someone standing in front of that possibility. looking at it carefully, respectfully, almost cautiously, because they understand that meaningful things deserve attention, meaningful things deserve effort, meaningful things deserve honesty. You know, sometimes people spend years searching for clarity, only to discover that clarity wasn't something they needed to find. It was something they needed to accept. And this entire journey feels connected to that idea. Accepting what matters, accepting what has changed, accepting what can no longer be ignored. Because the person we encountered at the beginning of this story was looking outward for answers, looking at circumstances, looking at distractions, looking at responsibilities, looking everywhere except the place that actually mattered. And somewhere along the way, their attention started turning inward, toward their own truth, toward their own heart, toward the things they could no longer explain away. And honestly, that may be the most important shift of all, because every meaningful chapter begins long before anyone sees it happening. It begins inside a thought, inside a realization, inside a quiet moment where somebody finally stops running from what they feel. And as I look at these cards one final time, the Eight of Wands, the Two of Cups, the Ace of Pentacles, I don't see an ending. I see a doorway standing quietly between what was and what could eventually become. And sometimes, the most interesting part of the story begins, the moment somebody decides they are finally ready to walk toward it. All right, Aquarius, that's where we're going to leave this story for today. And honestly, I feel like this reading wasn't really about finding all the answers. It was about noticing what's changing, what's becoming clearer, what's becoming harder to ignore. Sometimes the biggest shifts happen quietly, long before anyone talks about them out loud. So take what resonated with you and simply leave the rest. Thank you for spending a little part of your day here with me. I never take your time, your support, or your trust for granted. Wishing you peace, clarity, and a little extra kindness toward yourself as you move through the days ahead. And I'll see you in the next reading. Take care, Aquarius.